So now, I think close to 80% of Russia's oil revenues come from the shadow fleet. Essentially, what they spend on their military is basically the same amount they're getting for their oil. The biggest weapon in global sanctions is the US dollar. That's the big stick that the US has to play with.
Can anyone stop Russia's shadow fleet? That's the ragtag collection of ships quietly moving oil around the world in spite of Western sanctions. Well, the US and the UK are trying. They've now blacklisted 183 vessels that they say belong to the fleet. The question is, will it work? And could it finally start sapping Moscow's oil revenues with which it funds its war with Ukraine? Well, Arthur Sullivan joins me now for more. He's been following this for DW Business. Arthur, glad to have you in our tiny studio here.
Delighted to be here.
Let's get to it. Let's start, of course, with this term shadow fleet. It sounds really spooky. It sounds really sinister. It is doing something that goes directly against sanctions. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, the best way to think about the shadow fleet is to go back to the start of the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So at that time, just before Russia invaded, the vast majority of its oil was shipped on Western-owned ships around the world and critically covered by Western insurance. Then they brought in different sanctions, but the big one being the West, that is, brought in the price cap, which meant that Western insurance and shipping services would not be provided anymore unless oil was sold at a certain price. So Russia wanted to get around this, and the way it got around this,
pay that price,
Russia didn't want to be sending its oil around the world in accordance with this price cap, because they felt, well, we can get more for our oil.
Okay.
And they just wanted to operate basically in a way that wasn't, in their eyes, controlled by the West. And so the way they went about it was they went into the used tanker market. So you can, the lifespan of one of these big tankers is generally seen to be around 20 years, and they went into the very back end of that market, buying up, in some cases, 20-year-old tankers. They bought hundreds of them. And the plan then would be to send their oil around the world on these often very old, not very seaworthy tankers, because then they can evade and avoid dealing with the price cap. They can have different insurance schemes, different, outside of the eyes, essentially, of the International Maritime Order.
I was going to say, this doesn't really sound very reassuring about the quality of these ships, and yet this has frustrated the US and its allies, hasn't it?
Oh, it has been a hugely effective way for Russia to avoid, the sanctions, essentially, because if you look at the pattern of Russia's revenues, of how it's been, since the sanctions came in 2022, since the price cap came in, at the very, very start, still the majority or close to the majority of its oil revenues were coming via either the ships that were compliant with the price cap or ships that were pretending to be compliant with the price cap. So you also had the problem of what's known as attestation fraud, whereby there would be falsified pricing documents which would say, oh, this cargo is compliant with the price cap, but it actually wasn't. But over time, more and more of its revenues were going on shadow fleet ships. So now, I think close to 80% of Russia's oil revenues come from the shadow fleet. So it was a hugely effective way of Russia getting its oil around the world and selling it to buyers in the two big buyers really since the invasion, China and India. These ships were leaving Russian ports and traveling a long way to get to Chinese and Indian harbors, and it was largely working for a long time. Essentially, after a certain period, by the end of 2023, it was quite clear that the price cap was not working. The shadow fleet was essentially doing the job for Russia. Which
is why we're seeing these new measures coming in to try and stop this. How important is oil revenue for Russia? We talk about it funding the war in Ukraine. Can you give us an idea of how relevant that is?
Oil and gas have been sort of siblings in terms of Russia's, historical budget and how it gets its revenues from. It's critically important. But in the last few years, I would say oil has become arguably more important than ever in Russia's modern history, because obviously Europe was a huge customer for its gas. That has changed in the last 2 years. It still buys some gas, but much less than before. Oil is extremely important. I mean, oil and gas combined account for between 30 and 50% of Russia's annual revenues into their budget. So depending on the flows at a given time, and oil increasingly is the majority of that 30 to 50%. And as well as that, in the last 3 years, Putin has ramped up expenditure. The military budget has gone up threefold in 3 years. And roughly, it's an interesting actual correlation, but we don't know the exact figures because we can't be sure what to believe from Russia. But the official figure last year was that Russia took in around $110 billion from oil. And that is roughly in line with what it spends on its military. So it could be between 100 and 150, but essentially what they spend on their military is basically the same amount they're getting for their oil. So it's the fundamental plank. It's their most important economic weapon is oil.
Which is why this oil cap was supposed to be so important. It hasn't worked to this point. These new sanctions, among the measures there, 183 ships named here, many of them Russian-owned or maybe flagged in other nations as well. Will this naming and blacklisting of these ships, will that be effective? How does that even look, actually?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, the experts I've spoken to kind of took me through how this sort of first started. So when it was clear towards the end of 2023 that the price cap wasn't working, the US was the first to start going, well, let's start targeting these ships individually. Let's sanction an individual tanker. And they did a lot of good work in, first of all, identifying the tankers. As you said, they often are flagged to different nations. I mean, they're flagged to all sorts of places like
Barbados, I saw, Panama.
Barbados is quite common, Panama, even very small island nations in the Pacific. And then, the various insurance schemes are extremely dodgy. I mean, they're really opaque. In some cases, there is no insurance. In other cases, it's an insurance company that in absolutely no circumstances would actually pay out in the event of a spill. So what the US started doing was identifying these, and it started sanctioning them individually, and it was immediately effective. Indian refiners, Chinese ports, as soon as they saw that this ship was on a list, they were like, okay, we're not taking it from this ship. And what's interesting is that Russia, when it started buying these ships, I mean, originally they were paying like $15 million per ship, but because they wanted so many of them, the price went up quickly. So Russia has invested a lot of money in these ships, like maybe between 10 and 20 billion US dollars. So if suddenly these ships are being anchored and put out support,
they're spending more just to replace
that's sunken costs. Now, what's really interesting, Steve, and I don't want to labour the point, but around March last year, with the US presidential election looming, the US stopped doing this. They stopped sanctioning the individual tankers. Now, we don't know exactly why, but we can speculate that it was to do with the election, because they didn't want to risk destabilising, disturbing global oil prices, and they thought, well, let's leave it at that. The EU and the UK stepped in, but now critically, what the experts were calling for was we need to step this up again, and so that's why these latest sanctions, where they've sanctioned 183, including many new ships that have never previously been sanctioned, really ramps up the pressure again in the last days of the Biden administration.
That's interesting. This high wire act between sanctioning Russia and removing too much oil to the detriment of the global system is something I want to touch on in just a moment. But you mentioned India and China, refineries, their reactions when they saw that ships were sanctioned. Why is that? Help us understand, what are they seeing? Because there's no sanctions police that swoop down and arrest them, take them to sanctions jail. What are they fearing when we talk about U.S. sanctions?
It's a really interesting question. So sanctions have different powers depending on who's wielding the sanctions. The UK's power, for example, is often around insurance. The EU's power extends in other ways, but the biggest weapon in global sanctions is the US dollar. That's the big stick that the US has to play with. So if you're an oil trader in India, you're a refinery, you're a port in China that deals in oil, the number one currency by far in the global oil trade is the dollar. So you need a dollar account. And if you want to continue operating that, you need the US Treasury to be on board. But if you are flagrantly violating sanctions,
if you're on their sanctions list,
if you're on their and you're just saying to these ships, come on in, let's take this oil, we don't really care. Well, there's a risk. It may not happen, but there's a good risk that the US might limit your capacity to trade in the dollar at all. You're going to go out of business. Now, the US doesn't necessarily swoop in immediately as soon as an Indian refiner opts to take a ship. They're not going to jump in and say, right, that's it, you're on the blacklist. But there is a dialogue, and you can be sure that the US authorities are in dialogue with some of these players in India and China, especially in India, and they're saying, really tread carefully here. And for India and China, it's not worth the risk. They can get the oil from other places.
I find that especially interesting with India as well, because there's no interest, I would assume, in creating too much strife between the two nations, or sort of publicly calling out Indian companies. Can you sort of give us any sort of insight into that? Why is it there's a dialogue and there isn't this kind of immediate action or sort of calling them out?
Well, when it comes to India, I mean, India at the moment is playing a hugely important role as a kind of counterweight between US and China. So the US obviously has this massive geopolitical economic rivalry with China. India is a huge country in the region, and it's obviously non-aligned. It doesn't pick sides, but the US doesn't want to irritate or get into trade spats with India at a time when it's already in this sort of massive ideological struggle with China. So it's not in its interest necessarily to just kind of do whatever it wants with India, but likewise it's not in India's or Indian companies' interests to provoke a trade spat with the US over something like this, because the key point is here, there's lots of oil around. They can get it from other places. They don't necessarily need to go through. I mean, if they can buy Russian oil in their eyes legally, they're going to do that because it comes at a discount. But if there's a risk of them going out of business because the US dollar is going to be limited, or they're not going to be able to use dollars anymore, they're not going to do it.
Yeah. What is Russia's response likely to be? This is a bit of speculation. Do we have any idea how they're likely to respond? Are they going to keep buying new ships and continue doing this?
Well, interestingly, they did put out a statement on their foreign affairs website, helpfully in English, which I read, and it's sort of interesting to read because they very much sort of frame it in the context of US politics. They sort of say, well, this is just Biden, the Biden administration, now that they don't have to be answerable to the electorate anymore, just lashing out and trying to marginalise Russia with their Russophobic policies. And they leave it quite open in the text for possible negotiations with a Trump administration. That's quite clear. They also bizarrely bring up things like the California wildfires, and it's sort of, I mean, it doesn't really give us insights as to what their next move is, but I guess when we're trying to anticipate their next move, we can look at what they've done already. So before, when the price cap wasn't working, they expanded the shadow fleet. They can go down that road again, buy more tankers that aren't sanctioned, keep on sending it. But it's sort of, there's the law of diminishing returns. If they're keep being sanctioned and they keep having to stick these anchors at port and out to anchor, well then they're running out of options. They can try and comply with the price cap, or they can continue trying to, do this attestation fraud whereby cargoes are sending their oil around the world but with falsified pricing. So they're actually getting more for it than the price cap level of $60. So the thing is, Stephen, the key point with this is Russia's going to keep making billions from its oil no matter what the West does. But the aim of the Western coalition is not to end Russian supply. I mean, that's what the price cap was designed for. Keep it flowing but reduce the revenues. If you knock $1 off the barrel here for Russia, $1 off the barrel there, you're reducing what they're going to set, what they're going to take in. Yeah, and it's not, you're not going to end it altogether, but you're going to, bit by bit harm their overall war machine.
Is there actually a threat potentially that if these sanctions work so well and the cap sticks for some reason, and that Russia reduces its oil shipments around the world, that you could see a tightening of global supply that then comes back to hit some of these countries as well? You mentioned this kind of tightrope that they're walking, trying to diminish the profit that Russia pulls in, but at the same time keep supply there. Could that go the wrong way for the sanctioning nations?
Well, this has been the fear, like what I alluded to with the US president election, and we've seen all around the world how incumbent governments have been so impacted by anger from their voters over inflation. And what really drives inflation? It's energy costs. If you're a small corner shop or you're a big industrial factory, energy costs, when they're going up, too fast, that's what really gets passed on to consumers. So of course there is always this sort of fear around that. If we cut the Russian supply, well then we're going to have, high energy prices. It's not entirely clear that will happen. I mean, the thing is, Russia is part of OPEC Plus. OPEC Plus were supposed to end production cuts towards the end of last year, but they've extended that towards April. So there's going to continue with these production cuts with the OPEC Plus nations, because they're worried about falling oil prices. I mean, demand has been weak globally over the last few months, and the oil price has not been as high as those nations would like. So there were actual expectations that next year there would be an oversupply of oil. I mean, if I could predict the oil price, I wouldn't be here with you, Stephen. I mean, a lot of people, spend a lot of money every day trying to predict it, so no one knows what's going to happen with global oil. But of course, this has always been at the back of the Western coalition's kind of mind when it comes to the Russian oil, is the risk of annoying their own voters by, inadvertently leading to energy price spikes.
From everyone you've talked to for your reporting, how well will these new sanctions work compared to what we've seen so far, compared to how they actually target these ships?
Well, what I noticed over the last 2 years covering the story is that sometimes I would have conversations with people who are, quite passionately involved in trying to, target Russia with sanctions. And at times they were quite morose and quite downbeat, particularly when the price cap wasn't working. I mean, they were really miserable about how things were going. This time I sense a lot more optimism, because I think the one consistent message I've heard is that if you target the shadow fleet individually, it clearly works. We've seen that with how Chinese and Indian buyers are reacting to it. So there's actually optimism that you can really kill off the shadow fleet altogether.
It's the kind of behavior that they want to see from the buyers.
Exactly, and I think it's what, if you think about it like this way, what does Russia not want? I mean, what does Russia really think, okay, we can survive if you do this, we can survive if you do that, but if you do that, we're really in trouble. And I think they know that the shadow fleet, targeting the individual ships, is clearly not something in their interest. Sort of really targeting the buyers of Russian oil, not directly by putting sanctions on them, but making it really unappealing for them to buy this oil. And I think that's what this is doing. Now, Russia, they found ways around it before, they might do so again, but it has worked so far, and there's optimism around its overall long-term impact.
This has been a cat and mouse game. There's always solutions, sort of workarounds that Russia is finding. It probably will continue to be a cat and mouse game. Is it something that the new administration will pick up and continue to prosecute as seriously as the past administration in the U.S.? Do we have any signs or any idea?
It's so hard to know what Trump's going to do on this question. I mean, he has spoken in different ways, obviously, about Ukraine. At some stages, gives the feeling that he'll sell them down the river. At other points, he may well negotiate well on their behalf. We don't know. I mean, what's interesting is that the Biden administration has tried to make these sanctions somewhat Trump-proof, in that there will need to be congressional approval if they're going to be rolled back. Now, Trump could achieve that, but I don't know. I think what the Biden administration is trying to do before it leaves office is to try and weaken Russia's potential position at the negotiating table, because they probably do feel they will be at the negotiating table soon. I mean, Putin has repeatedly sort of left it clear that he's open to talking with Trump. Trump obviously does that as well. I think the Biden administration are trying to really, weaken them out of perhaps fear that Trump may allow them to go in stronger than they otherwise would be.
Okay, that's Arthur Sullivan, reporter for DW Business. Arthur, thank you. And of course, you can find out more about these and other stories online, dw.com. Check us out on the YouTube channel here. Thanks a lot.